Hi, I'm Kara Swisher. I am really sorry I am not there in New York. I believed your crazy mayor that there would be a lot of snow and that Snowmageddon was on the way, and it turned out to be apparently a fizzard. So I apologize. I'm headed back to San Francisco this afternoon, and I'm sorry I'm not there at Cracking the Code because it's one of the topics I talk about a lot in Silicon Valley and one of the more disturbing parts of the technology industry. Let me go over a couple of things that I was going to talk about. I had a really fancy presentation, but I think the numbers really speak for themselves, and I'll talk about some of the problems and then hopefully some of the solutions. The first thing is, I think it's more dire than people realize how few women are participating in the technology sector in a significant way, except as consumers. Now, right now, women make up more than half of the consumers of all these new technologies, and in fact are very enthusiastic users of them. They understand them, they use them in all parts of their lives. When it comes down to the people that are making and creating them, things change rather dramatically. Right now, there are going to be 1.2 million jobs in the technology sector in 2022. It is the one area of the economy where we have sorry, a lot of growth and where there are a lot of promising careers to be made. That said, even though this is the one part of the economy that people should be rushing towards, and half the workforce are women, only 24% of women are right now in the computing sector. Now that number is a bit skewed because it has a lot to do with science. Women as doctors, women as biochemistry researchers. In science, 63% of the workforce is women. That's a very large contingent and again, obviously surpasses men. But when you get to the parts that are sort of inventing the internet and are working in the digital space, only 25% of women are in the math area and only 14% of the women are in the computing area. This is the Intel Science and Engineering finalist, which it says a lot of, it's on trend with other things. That's an unusual number, 14%, 25%. In other words, a very small amount of the women in the pipeline are, people in the pipeline are women. It gets worse when you think about the degrees and where women are getting degrees. Even though, again, women make up more than half of the women getting undergraduate degrees in this country, only 18% in the computing sector are women. Now, this is a very small number, except it's half the number it was in 1985. In 1985, 37% of the women, the people who were graduating with computing degrees were women. That is a drop, and it's an incredible drop that's happened. Worse still, when you get into the more thinking about diversity, only 3% of those women are African American, only 5% are Asian, and only 2% are Hispanic. Obviously, it's a workforce made of men. I think anyone who lives in Silicon Valley understands that. It is a largely male, largely white population, and it causes some real problems for women to break into. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pipeline. That's where there's a thing I call the P's, where it's not the word you're thinking of, but it's a P problem. The first thing is pipeline. The pipeline of women coming into technology fields and computing fields has problems, and it starts very early with women in school, with girls in school, where girls do very well in school until 4th grade, when something happens and they drop rather quickly out of the math and science track, which is mostly dominated by boys. There's a lot of reasons for this, but that's where it begins, where there aren't enough girls in the math and science area, and as you move forward through high school and into college, the resulting problem is obvious. We don't have enough women choosing these professions early on in their lives. There's all kinds of reasons for this, which I'll go into in the next part, which is about perception. But the fact of the matter is we don't encourage girls to stay in math, even if they like it. They tend to opt out of it for all kinds of reasons. There's a very famous study done by Gina Davis, who has done a lot of research on girls and how they learn. And what happens to girls is that they realize that this profession isn't one where they see themselves, where there's no perception. So let's talk about perception, which is the second part that's really important. Sheryl Sandberg, who is a very well-known executive, the CEO of Facebook, is on the board of Disney. One of the stories she told me recently was about being on the board and trying to get the Disney board to do more movies about where girls are the protagonists. One of the things she told the board when she was talking about this, and of course she's one of the few women on the board, I think, or there's probably a few on that board, but was that she doesn't mind princess stories, but she'd like the princesses to have jobs. And this goes into Gina Davis's research, which is about the fact that in cartoons, in all kinds of depictions, in all kinds of things that boys and girls watch in the media, in fictional kind of television things and movies, very few of the women have jobs. And I know that sounds crazy, but all the boys have jobs. And of those jobs, women have silly jobs. And I'm not saying every job is silly, but they don't have substantive science computing jobs. Mostly, there aren't many girls in those movies. Let me give you an example. The movie Nemo, Finding Nemo. Think about when you watch that movie, when you're thinking about the various characters in the movie. Now, it's a movie about fish. Now, it shouldn't mean anything. It's just fish. It's a father trying to find his son in the ocean. Adorable, cute, huge hit, huge impact on kids. Love this movie. Think about how many women there are in the sea in that movie. Just think that for a second. There's actually just one. In the entire movie, there's one woman in the sea, in the entire ocean. And she's kind of crazy. She's played by Ellen DeGeneres, and she's insane. Otherwise, there are apparently no fish women in the ocean, and no fish women who can help anybody in the ocean. I know that sounds crazy, but when you start to sort of iterate it around all kinds of movies, it creates a perception that women are not smart either, or that they don't have jobs and things like that. You have to start watching these things. I have 2 boys. I pay a lot of attention to the imagery around. They feel great about themselves because most of the imagery that's being reflected back at them tells them they're fantastic. They probably think they're more fantastic than they are, but that's a good thing when you're thinking about where you're moving in your career. It's a real problem when you start to iterate it later in life and when people see these images. I'm not trying to blame Kim Kardashian for everything, because actually she happens to be an excellent businesswoman. But the fact of the matter is, when these things start to build on each other and you don't see people like yourself, you tend not to go into these sectors. Again, perception has to change of what is acceptable and what is something that you would want to do. The third one is personality. Unfortunately, in the technology space, a lot of the personality of what a techie is sort of Mark Zuckerberg. There was a VC that recently, I was talking about this issue, which I talk a lot about in Silicon Valley, and the VC, who was trying to be helpful but actually was somewhat of a clod, said if there was a Marcia Zuckerberg, perhaps more women would go into technology. I didn't quite know what to say when he said this, except that you're an idiot. But actually, I think what he was trying to express is that the personalities of technology are not women. There are a few women: Marissa Mayer of Yahoo, Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook, Meg Whitman of HP. But they're very few and far between, and they aren't in the top ranks of these companies. A couple of years ago, I wrote a piece called "The Men and No Women of Facebook." This was just before Sheryl got there, and all I did was I put the pictures of all the men that run Facebook. And I think when you look at something visually and see that there are no people like yourself, it becomes really quite staggering when you actually visually look at it. I did the same thing years later with the boards of Web 2.0 companies. And these are companies at the time like Twitter and Groupon and Foursquare. And I was looking at their boards. Now, these are products that are primarily used by women, Pinterest and others, and there were no women on these boards. Another thing when you don't visually see people in places. But when you get back to personality, it's a really important thing that we start to shift the idea of what a techie is. Right now, again, it is a hoodie-wearing, geeky guy who never went to the prom, essentially. Now, and then later become extraordinarily rich and were able to buy the prom or something like that. But the fact of the matter is there actually is a very nasty part of this, in that, which is pointed out by Maria Klawe at Harvey Mudd University, is that there are people who are gatekeepers to these jobs. And what happens is, when there's a group of people, it's a tribe of people, and they're like each other, they tend to protect the tribe from something different. And it's very hard for other people that are different, and not just women, to make it's certain kinds of men and different people that aren't like them to get their way in there. And one of the things that Maria Klawe was trying to do was to teach computer science in a wholly different way. So there wasn't this one gatekeeper, and it's usually just one person who is sort of shaming people or being difficult or arrogant, so other people cannot enter the scene or see themselves in that scene. It's a really important issue to think about the personality of what a technologist is and how we need to expand it outward. The last one, which I call performance, is not the problem. Women are all kinds of tests show that women are excellent in these computing fields. It is not a question of performance, but it is a question of performance of success of these companies, because most of the big companies over the last 10 years have been founded by men, and they've been huge successes. You think of a Facebook, you think of a Snapchat, you can just go through company after company. And again, these are the founding members of these companies. Now, while there's lots of women at pretty relatively high places, they aren't in the positions where they're actually leading and founding the companies. And again, a small handful of people that you can choose from and look up towards. Because of that, VCs tend to fund the women, fund the people that they feel comfortable with and they feel successful with. And so you see sort of this, it's not a virtuous circle, it's a not virtuous circle, where the VCs fund people who have been successful and then continue to work in that pattern. And there's no performance to show why they should invest in women, even though if they don't try in the first place, they're not going to get a success. And so that is going to be a real problem. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think need to be done to shift that around. One is to figure out a way to encourage girls to think coding is an important thing, and encourage everyone in this country to think that, but especially girls. There's been some initiatives by the Obama administration where girls who code, all kinds of things to do that. It has to continue. There have to be avenues where girls and women begin to see that these are viable careers that they can succeed in. One of the things that I think works really well with girls and women is that they have a reason to do it, that there's an outcome at the end. Women tend to be more attracted by outcomes and positive outcomes. Just recently there was a thing at CES where they showed women learning coding in order to make a physical arm, an arm work. It was an arm for people who had lost their arms. This is an outcome. If you know how to do coding, you can then create this arm and then affect someone's life. It's important that we start to give examples of why these things would be something that would be a job that has an outcome. And very important to start very early, and especially when girls who are very good at math and science, holding them onto that track and making them feel welcome in the area. And that has to go to our educational system, how we teach, and how we teach not just girls, but other people who feel like they opt out of the system because they don't fit the profile. The second thing is, one of the problems with a lot of the girls who code and different things is that it leaves out men. Men have to be part of the solution of this. One of the things that, there's study after study that diversity creates more successful companies. And of the companies in Silicon Valley that are more diverse, they are more successful. Google, for example, is a highly diverse company comparatively. Now, let me just say they're not that diverse, because recent studies, workplace information that all the companies put out, they're mostly 70% white men, essentially. But the fact of the matter is they're encouraging and trying to get women in the pipeline. Diverse companies are successful companies. Again, this is an economic argument that we have to continue to make so that people understand that the more diverse your culture, the better you are at succeeding going forward. The last thing that I think is important is for all of us to try to check something that they're calling in Silicon Valley unconscious bias. Unconscious bias means that we don't immediately assume people are sexist. We don't immediately assume they're doing this on purpose. A lot of what's happening, unfortunately, is not your typical kind of sexism, where it's very obvious that they're discriminating against women. What it is an unconscious bias, a continuing to look at the world in a way that you think it is versus the way it should be. It's a really problematic situation. It happens time and time again. I was recently at an event in Silicon Valley where someone asked a question about women in tech, and a very young technologist, a young man, answered by saying to this questioner, it was a woman who was asking the question about the difficulties of women in tech. He was trying to give her advice and unfortunately came off more like an idiot when he said, you should try to pretend there is no sexism. You should operate as if there is not a problem. I know he meant well, but unfortunately I jumped on him saying that people do not want to be in a society where they aren't being realistic about what's happening. There is sexism happening here, and we have to all be aware of that at all times and pointing it out at all times. I think of all the things that are most difficult is that everybody, many people, not everybody, wants to fix the problem, and they are aware of the problem, and then we continue to have the problem. And if statistics continue the way they are, this is going to be with us for a while and iterate through the next generation where all the jobs are moving in our society. I'm sorry to be so serious. I'm much funnier in person. But one of the things that is really important for me is to give everybody opportunity, and not just here, but throughout the world. There is talent all over the world, and there are women and girls trapped in places all over the world where digital jobs can free them from their situations. The world is turning into a closely knit, digitally connected place where people can really thrive where they are using these tools. This is the internet and the digital revolution is a gift to humanity, and I'm hoping that all of humanity can participate in it going forward. Thanks a lot, and I'm sorry I'm not there. I'm a complete wimp for not being there, and I hope that you have a great conference and a great hackathon. Bye.